Thank you all for coming. I'm so thrilled that you came to our first MOSAIC of the year. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Mia. Thank you. Thank you. I am so thrilled that we've been working with Abdul-Rehman for the past couple months on putting this together. He's a brilliant scholar, a brilliant mind, and you will hear so much of his incredible wealth of information in this talk. All of you who did the workshop, you already saw all of the amazing things he pulled together, primary sources and headlines, and that great map. And you all pieced that map together on your own, and also with your fabulous facilitators. Can we give your facilitators a little round of applause? We even had some of our students step in and take the reins. That was wonderful. So without further ado, I present to you Mr. Abdul-Rehman Malik and his talk, From Damascus to Dunkin, How Coffee Changed the World.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, guys. Oh, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this morning with all the considerations. Right in the middle of the workshop, my wife texted and said that the power had gone out where we live up in Westville. So there you go. There's exciting things waiting for us when we get home. And they will all be made better by coffee. When I think back on my own personal relationship with coffee, and had I grown up here in the United States, I'd probably associate it with this. Dunkin Donuts is the most ubiquitous coffee brand in America. I have been to the most unusual little places, and old Dunkin Donuts pops up. And there's an absolute commitment that the American people have to this brand, even though the coffee is mediocre and the donuts will eventually kill you. But I did not grow up in the United States. I grew up in Canada. And my earliest memories of coffee, oh no, you bugger. Oh. There. Good Lord. This is what I remember as my earliest memories of coffee, and I'll tell you why. I grew up outside of the city of Toronto, Canada's most multicultural, in fact, one of the most diverse cities on the planet Earth. My family is originally from the subcontinent. My father was born in Punjab before the partition of India into India and Pakistan. My mother was born in Pakistan, but both of our families were refugees from India to Pakistan on the creation of the country in 1947. My family is a chai family, is a tea family. We are the kind of family that has tea breakfast, tea lunch, tea afternoon, tea dinner, and if the tea is not brewing whilst the dinner is being finished, my father will still to this day glare over at the kitchen and say, "I don't hear the water boiling." At which point, the answer you should give, "It's because, Dad, the tea's already brewing." And if that's not the answer, he's like, "What's going on?" To this day, I'll go back, I'm 43 years old, I'll go back home to Toronto and my parents' home, 2, 3 in the morning, I'm hearing the kettle go off, I'm hearing the rustle of feet, my parents are downstairs making chai. Chai tea was all about the home. Brewing for one another, brewing for each other, sharing the experience of tea together, it was a comfort. Coffee, on the other hand, was special. We had coffee as a family once a week. On Sundays, we would go to the mosque, which was in the city, and we'd have a Sunday school. We'd attend some talks, and we'd have the youth group. And on the way home, my mom and dad would always stop at the corner of Highway 427 and Dundas at the Mr. Donut. And my earliest memories of coffee are it being special. We'd walk into the Mr. Donut. I'd smell that incredible brew, and you know that smell. I just need to say it. We all know it. It's the thing that we smell in the morning in our homes. It's the thing that keeps us coming back to Dunkin Donuts. It's that smell of brewed coffee, a little bit of bitterness and sweetness, and those lovely fresh donuts. And we would sit down, and that was the time we'd sit around, and we'd sort of just talk. And it wasn't about family stuff. It was mostly about the world, and I felt very grown up that my parents were buying me coffee. To this day, my parents will go out for coffee. We rarely brew coffee at home. I do now, and they're happy about it, but they would never brew it themselves. Coffee for them was a deeply social beverage. Now, like many of you, I would have always thought that coffee came from Colombia. In fact, in a recent survey in the United States, when people were asked, where does coffee come from? The vast majority said Colombia. Juan Valdez has done a very good job. And Juan Valdez is the creation of a big corporation that wants to sort of market coffee in a particular way. But then I remember, I think it was in high school or early university, I found a little article somewhere. It might have been at the mosque. It might have been in our own family's bookshelves, which was, the article was entitled, "Coffee, the Wine of Islam." Now, we were a fairly observed to be observant Muslim family. We didn't drink. And so this caught my eye, the wine of Islam. I said, this must be some special kind of coffee. So I started reading this article, and it was a strange article because it had stories about fatwas and beheadings, of intrigue and espionage, of people laying siege to cities, of colonizers stealing coffee plants, and of mystics who not only brewed coffee but used it in secret spiritual ceremonies. So, you know, being a bit of a cynic and knowing that my co-religionists can sometimes exaggerate, I was kind of like, I don't know about this. I don't see any references. I kind of stuck it in the back of my head and I forgot about it. Fast forward to the mid-1990s, and the first Starbucks opened in Toronto. I was one of those eager people who went and lined up to get my, it was called the New Guinea Peaberry. Some of you old-time Starbucks drinkers will know the New Guinea Peaberry was a big deal, wasn't it? And they wouldn't make it every day, but if you asked them nicely, they'd brew one just for you. And so I would go and say, here's the New Guinea Peaberry, and we'd have it. And all of a sudden, this world of coffee started to open up. It was like, wow, coffee comes from Indonesia, and coffee comes from Ethiopia, and coffee comes from Kenya. Maybe there was something going on with that article that I'd read. And so I started even more, delving into it, getting into it. And then one of my own sort of spiritual teachers, who himself follows a mystical or Sufi path, one day I was speaking about my love for coffee, and he kind of said to me, he goes, you know, where I'm from, we have special prayers that we say before drinking coffee. I'm like, say what? He goes, no, we write prayers. He said, there's short prayers and there's long prayers. I'm like, Sheikh, how long are the long prayers? He says, they can run 4 or 5 pages. I said, doesn't the coffee get cold? He says, we make it very hot. But he said, here's a nice short one. And he introduced me to this, which is known as the Fatiha al-Saghir. It's the short Fatiha, the short opening prayer that one reads before imbibing coffee. And it's a magnificent prayer. And so you begin by reciting the opening chapter of the Quran, which is a common prayer amongst people of Muslim faith, but particularly in what we would call the Middle East. And it says that you make this prayer for the scholars of the Qahwa al-Bunniya, the brown coffee, the brown elixir, right? And the family of the Prophet. And it goes on to praise the men and women of spirituality and those who made it. And then it asks of God, please relieve me of my debt. Please give me goodness in this life and in the next life. And you finish off and you recite the prayer and then you imbibe the coffee. I was hooked. My teacher was from the Yemen. And I had to go further. I had to go back to those articles. And once I started going down that rabbit hole, I realized myself that I almost believed that my love for coffee was sort of destined. I was destined to meet this lover. And all my life I'd been playing games. And now I understood. Because I knew that coffee did something to me. In the 1580s, a great scholar and the preeminent scholar in the Arabic language of coffee, Abdul-Qadir al-Jaziri, who was from Al-Jazirat al-Arab, which is the Arabian Peninsula, wrote a book on coffee. It's 67 folios, and it's preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. In that, he quotes another scholar, Ibn Abdul-Ghaffar, who's considered one of the earliest scholars of coffee. And he described coffee in this beautiful way. He said, there's a word that we have for coffee, and it's called marqaha. Marqaha is qaf, and it's ha. So it almost comes from inside of you like a breath. Marqaha. And what is marqaha? Marqaha is the feeling of sprightliness of spirit, mental well-being, and altogether wholeness that you get from a good cup of coffee. I have barista friends who've never heard of this word, but they know what it is. Because a good barista knows what a God shot is. Ever heard this term, God shot? A good barista will say, I'm looking for the God shot. And the God shot is that cup of espresso, so perfectly engineered, timed to perfection, dosed at the right level, with the perfect water, that when you have it, it's like, ooh, you disappear. You take it in, and the flavors overwhelm you. That's what every great brewer of coffee is looking for. The Arabs knew it in the late 1400s. They called it marqaha. And so my journey took me right back to the highlands of the Yemen, outside the port of Aden and the port of Mocha. Keep that word in mind. Important. And it took me back to this almost mythic character, Ali ibn Umar ash-Shadali, from the great Aidarus family, who are related to the Prophet Muhammad himself. And he was a great mystic of that period. Ali Umar ibn ash-Shadali al-Aidarus had students, had disciples who were with him. And it is said that he learned from his teacher, Ad-Dabahani, of this red cherry fruit, that if you chewed the fruit, you'd become alive. You'd become literally electric. We call it caffeine. You'd literally, and of course, you know, when you have the coffee fruit, it's unfiltered. That's all the caffeine. It's like fruit. It's dry, it tastes horrible. But you have it, woo. And so it was said that Ad-Dabahani had been ill, and he'd gone to Ethiopia, and on his way back, he had brought these coffee beans with him. We now know through vegetal analysis that coffee arrived in Yemen probably around 1000 or 1100. But wasn't actually cultivated until a little bit later. Coffee was not cultivated in Ethiopia until after it was cultivated in the Yemen. So we often say that coffee had its origins in Ethiopia, but it's found its soul in the Yemen. Coffee found its soul in the Yemen because in Ali ibn Umar ash-Shadli's spiritual circle, where they of course say their canonical prayers, but at night they'd be swaying and singing and playing the drums, and they would gather together in remembrance of God, trying to achieve mystical union with the divine. What they were doing was passing around the cup of coffee throughout the night. So initially it was chewing the cherries, then they would remove the husk, called the gishar or the qishar, and they would boil that like a tea. And the Arabs still do that, right, Sultan? You boil the fruit, and it's delicious because you add cardamom and spices and beautiful things into it. And eventually, they started cooking the beans on a plate, on a hot plate almost, over the fire. And then they would grind it, and they would literally infuse it. And what came out was probably a very strong, bitter brew. But what was amazing about it was that they would put it into one cup, and they would pass it around. And this happened in the ceremonies. But of course, religious people can't keep everything to themselves. And soon, in the port of Aden, in the port of Mocha, in the surrounding towns to where the mystics lived, people started drinking coffee. And they were like, what is this elixir? What is this beautiful beverage? And so outside of the mosques, the Sufis would serve, the mystics would serve. And they realized, man, coffee grows everywhere. So people started cultivating their own plants. And by the time we get to the late 1400s, the Yemen, particularly in that region, is a coffee drinking culture. It's a coffee drinking culture, but something happens. Something that we got to know about the Yemen, and something that's obscured by the news of the Yemen today, is that Yemen was the end of a great long caravan route to Aden, from all the way from Damascus and Cairo and Constantinople and Byzantium and the Sassanid Persian Empire. These was the flow of goods in and out across this amazing thing called the island of Arabia, Jaziratul Arab. They were going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And the Yemenis were hard tea traders. So what did they start doing? They'd take the green beans with them, and they'd go on their journeys. And that brings us to pictures of the Yemen itself. The pictures are almost unbelievable. These are pictures taken in the last 2 years. Some of you will not know that the first skyscrapers in the world were built in the Yemen. The Yemeni architects and the people, particularly from the valleys of Hadramaut and around it, built buildings sometimes of 6, 7, 8, 10 stories, which had running sewage, which transported water, and which were built on these incredible outcroppings. This is one of the farms. This is one of the citadels, a village, which sits along one of the valleys where coffee is grown today. Look at that. I mean, it's stunning. Steppe architecture, steppe irrigation was in the Yemen from at least the 1400s. And look at how verdant that is. That is what, for me, it's almost like a visual shock to when I think of the Yemen I read in the New York Times or the Washington Post or I see on CNN today. This is where people live, and they continue to cultivate coffee. And these valleys, these rift valleys, surrounded by mountain and sometimes desert, but lush valleys, extend for hundreds of miles. And then we get to 1511. No story about the Middle East is complete without a good fatwa, without a good religious edict. Keep that in mind for your later studies of Islamic and Middle Eastern history. In 1511, the Mamluk, which was a dynasty which ruled from Cairo, and it was actually known as the slave dynasty because these had been people who had been enslaved and had not only freed themselves but had become the rulers of the land. The Mamluk Dynasty controlled what is now known as Mecca, where the holiest shrine and site of Islam is, the Kaaba, to which all Muslims who pray turn their direction of prayer. In 1511, the potentate, the local ruler, Mamluk ruler of Mecca, was walking along outside the precincts of the holy mosque, and he started smelling something delicious. And then he saw a group of men sitting together, drinking this delicious thing. And he saw the fire, and he could see the popping of the beans. And they were imbibing and they were singing songs. And he's like, what is going on? And so he went to his advisors. He says, I've seen this in the holy mosque. What is this? And they said, it's gahwa. It's gahwa. This is the people from Yemen. They drink it all the time. He says, why haven't I heard of this gahwa? Khair Bey was his name. And Khair Bey was an interesting cat because he wasn't a very good ruler, first. Terribly corrupt. But not only that, he had another problem in town. He had an alcohol problem. Because in the holiest of cities of Islam, speakeasies and taverns were going up from time to time. People were flouting the sacred law. And therefore, Khair Bey was under pressure from the religious authority to shut down the taverns and the places of alcohol. And now this new thing comes into being, this thing called coffee. Well, long story short, he convenes a council of the scholars. He brings 2 Persian doctors who taste the coffee, and in order to ingratiate themselves to Khair Bey, take the coffee, and as it is written in Abdul Qadir al-Jaziri's history, they swoon as if they have taken some deep intoxicant, like hashish or opium. They swoon and they say, oh my God, I can't see clearly anymore. I can't stand up. Oh, I've forgotten my prayers. And they collapse to the ground. And all the scholars said, oh my God, look at this, ban coffee. And so immediately a religious edict was written. In the name of God, we ban coffee because it is an intoxicant like alcohol, like khamr, like wine and spirits. And Khair Bey thought he was real clever. So he rolled it up, gave it to his emissaries and said, take it to the sultan, take it to the king, Mamluk king in Cairo, and tell him I have found an evil and I have vanquished it. Well, it took a while for that to get across the desert. It arrives in Cairo, and the last Mamluk sultan, because he's about to be overthrown by the Ottomans in 1517, he looks at it and basically rips it up. Because little does Khair Bey know, coffee has already arrived in Cairo and is being drunk in the royal palace. So unhappy was the Sultan with Khair Bey, he said, Khair Bey, back to Cairo with you. You're in big trouble. And those religious scholars who signed the edict, the head one, bring him back as well. And those 2 doctors, bring him back as well. Now I have a bit of a macabre story, but it's Halloween, so I'll tell it. I think God has a bit of a sense of humor. And I often say that coffee is God's beverage, and no amount of human interference in it can stop it. Khair Bey returned to Cairo and was literally drawn and quartered for insubordination and stupidity. The scholar who had signed the edict died a very terrible death. It overtook him. And the two doctors, the Persian doctors, on their way to Cairo, they were killed by highwaymen, robbers. What does that tell you? Don't mess with coffee. By the time we get to Cairo, coffee is the beverage. And now think about Cairo. Cairo I want you to kind of imagine Cairo for a moment. Today it's a city of 15 million people by day, 21 million people by day, 15 million people by night. But Cairo is the heart of learning, a place of gardens, a place of libraries and mosques and seminaries and research and scholarship from all over the world. And in the back alleys of the great Al-Azhar University, created by the great Fatimid Empire many centuries earlier, the students from the Yemen who are studying at the Al-Azhar bring their coffee with them. And they bring their coffee and they're brewing it. And the other students are saying, oh, can we have some? And so these little coffee shacks form in Cairo. But we also know that in 1530, the first cafe opens up in Damascus. And we know that before 1554, there are cafes in Aleppo. In the great cities of the East, the crossing point of empires, coffee is now being drunk as a popular beverage. It's not without controversy. In 1521, a scholar from the Al-Azhar declares coffee haram or impermissible again. It lasts about 2 weeks because when the next shipment from the Yemen comes, all is solved. And in 1532, during the holy month of Ramadan, a very zealous police chief tries to ban coffee, and it results in riots. People riot through the streets and say, you can't take our coffee away from us. And by that time, the Ottomans have realized this coffee thing, it's a cash crop. People want this beverage. I'm going to change tack for just a moment, and then we're going to come back to the bulk of our story. In the Yemen, the Ottoman Empire now controls the coffee trade. I want you to think of this like controlling the sugar trade or controlling the oil trade. This is now a massive cash crop. All of the coffee in the world, virtually at this point, all the coffee in the world is coming from the Yemen. I want you to think about that. It's literally going from the Yemen everywhere else. The colonial powers have already started having a look in. And it is said that no live coffee plant can leave the Yemen on punishment of death. So what happens is that all the green beans, when they're picked, are boiled to kill off any possibility of them being planted. That's how seriously they took it. But there was one man, a pious man, from India, known popularly as Baba Budan, they say. And Baba Budan was a mystic. He'd gone to the Yemen to study with the mystics. And he was on his way back to India because, of course, travel to India was not uncommon. And Baba Budan said, I love coffee. I think I can break the law. So it is said that Baba Budan took 7 seeds. Some people said that they put it in his luxurious beard, probably much bigger than mine. Some people say that he tied it in a band around his chest. What we do know is that during the late 1500s, coffee begins to grow in the region of Karnataka in South India, where coffee remains until today, along the Malabar coast. Coffee's first home outside of Yemen is not Colombia or Brazil, but is actually India. And India plays a very important role in the story and the history of coffee. And here now we come to the third act in our story. The third act. If Ethiopia was coffee's origin and Yemen was where coffee found its soul, it was in Ottoman Constantinople that coffee became an art form. This, I know you can't see it too clearly, this is an Ottoman era miniature, and our expert in Islamic art, my friend Sultan Al-Qasimi, can give us more details on this later. This is a miniature describing what an Ottoman coffee house would have looked like. And if you look closely, you will see in one corner the coffee being brewed. In another corner, the scholars sitting, reading the religious texts. In another, musicians. In another, people playing backgammon. In another, people smoking. The nargile, the hookah, the shisha. And all of them being served coffee by who? In the Ottoman culture of coffee, a personality developed. Call it the first barista. The first barista was known as what? The Kavechi Basha. Literally the pasha, the master of coffee. That this was the person and they ended up being women Kavechi Bashas and male Kavechi Bashas. And in fact, in what is known as the harem, or the women's quarters of the Ottoman Sultan, there was in those quarters female Kavechi Bashas who would serve the mother of the Sultan and the wife of the Sultan and the consorts of the Sultan. The Kavechi Basha, the barista, became so important because the barista would hear all the conversation in the cafes. In 1554, 2 Syrian merchants opened the first coffee shop in Istanbul, and after that we lose count. Thousands of cafes open. And if you can, this is what I want you to imagine. They're serving the best coffee in the world. The Yemeni coffee is the purest and best coffee in the world, to this day. And we'll talk about that right at the end. The quality of coffee, I had one coffee entrepreneur in Istanbul tell me about 3 years ago when I was working on a documentary on coffee for the BBC. He said to me, you know what the funniest thing is? He says, we talk about specialty coffee now. He says, in the place that I am today, if I was here in 1620 in Ottoman Istanbul, I'd be drinking better coffee than this. And it blew my mind. And I'm like, absolutely. It's coming from the Yemen. It's organic. No pesticides. It's the good stuff that's coming. And for the Ottomans, it became an obsession. But this is where the social revolution happens. And particularly for our young students, I want to keep this in mind. We grow up, all of us grow up, with places that we gather. We go to the shop, we go to the cafe, we go to restaurants, we go to a club, we go to places. If you can imagine in these cultures and societies, there are actually very few places where people interact formally. The mosque, the markaz, which is the souk, where you buy and sell, the madrasa. And then maybe the tavern, but it's kind of not allowed. There are very few places, there's no restaurants per se, until after the coffee house. The coffee house, the Ottomans say, is the divan of the home, the place of gathering in the home, outside of the home. The coffee house is a social revolution because we create a space that's not about commerce per se, that's not about religion per se, that's not about learning per se. It's a place where you and I get together and we just talk. And maybe we exchange information, maybe we make business, but we talk and we gather. And I don't know who's going to come through that door. Because what was amazing about the coffee house from its very beginning was that it was a place of many different social classes. Later on, the coffee house becomes for rich and poor. But during most of the period of the coffee house, and it's one of the things that surprised the European travelers, the priests and others who were doing missionary work, who were traveling to Old Byzantium, going to the sacred sites in Jerusalem, what were they seeing? They would go and see the coffee house and say, it's a most unusual place where the rich and poor gather together. And they talk, and they play backgammon, and they smoke hookah, and at night they tell stories to each other. How did stories like the tales of the Arabian Nights, which were a collection of folk tales, how did they get disseminated? In the coffee houses. People sat and listened to each other's stories. Travelers came and regaled them with details of worlds they did not know. This became the CNN, the New York Times. This became the Twitter and the social media of its day. That's what makes the coffee house so special. And Ralph Hattocks, the great historian of coffee, said this would not have been possible without Muslim culture and the culture that developed out of Muslim civilization. Because encoded in coffee was a sense of service. One of the beautiful things you see when we travel through the Middle East is this sense of welcoming the traveler, the caravanserai, offering something beautiful, giving a drink. Come, you're our guest. This adab, this good manner of welcoming guests becomes enshrined in a place like the coffee house. And here we have the big picture. We start here in the Yemen. Coffee goes to India. And then, as the coffee travels through the Arab world into Turkey. But the colonial powers are hot on the trail of coffee. The Dutch are the first to successfully steal the coffee plant. And they take it to where? They take it to Ceylon. And then they take it to Amsterdam, where they try to grow it in the botanical gardens. And that botanical plant is very important to our history. From Yemen, coffee eventually returns back to Ethiopia and has begun to be cultivated a little bit later. But then there's other routes. There's several routes to India. And the Dutch take it to Ceylon, present-day Sri Lanka. And coffee is grown in Sri Lanka. And then coffee starts making the big journeys. The Dutch take it to Java. The Dutch take it to Java in the late 1600s, to the port of Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, where they try, first unsuccessfully and then successfully, to plant coffee over here in Java, in modern-day Indonesia. The French steal a coffee plant, and they take it to the small little island right there off the coast of Madagascar called Reunion Island. And Reunion Island to this day has a special varietal which is known as Bourbon. If you ever see Reunion Island Bourbon, buy a bag. It's expensive, but it's delicious. And from Reunion Island now, it starts into the African colonies as the colonization movement spreads. From the Netherlands, it's given as a gift to King Louis XIV in the early 1700s. That plant, which is planted in the Jardin des Plantes on the left bank of the city of Paris, a shard of that is taken to Martinique by an intrepid colonist. And he plants it in Martinique, beginning the French growth of coffee in the Caribbean. But the Caribbean sees Italian Jesuits bring coffee eventually. The Portuguese get into the coffee game. The Portuguese were very eager. In fact, some say that the Portuguese were the first to experience coffee, but the last to get their hands on a plant. And the Portuguese now spread it, the French now spread it, and now what else is going on at this time? Students, what other big transatlantic trade is happening at this very time? Triangular trade. What's happening? Who is being transported in triangular trade? Enslaved people. There is a dark relationship between coffee and enslavement. As coffee becomes to grow more popular in the cities of Europe, and initially it reaches places like Vienna, where of course there's trade with the Ottoman Empire. As there's this trade with the Ottoman Empire, but now as coffee becomes a global commodity, this dark history begins. And slave labor is used in places like Haiti, the island of Hispaniola, which makes up Haiti in the present-day Dominican Republic. And in fact, it is said that the Haitian Revolution happens because enslaved people revolt against the wicked, difficult conditions that is placed on them because of coffee production. And so what you have all of a sudden is coffee begins in the Yemen, but is now jumping around. What does that mean to us culturally? And I'm going to finish on these last 3 slides. Culturally speaking, when we get to 1600, coffee is being drunk in places like Venice. Why? Because Venice has trade with the Ottoman peoples. And in Venice, people are drinking, and the cardinals and the bishops are seeing this and saying, what are you drinking? This Mohammedan elixir, they say. This Turkish brew, this heathen beverage. God gave us wine, they declare, because wine is sweet, but God gave the Mohammedan the blackest, most sootiest beverage because it comes from the devil himself. And so it was called the devil's cup, and you'll read it in the Catholic annotations. So in 1600, when the bishops realized they were losing the battle against coffee, they went to the Pope, Pope Clement VIII, and they said, Pope Clement, you must declare coffee the devil's cup, and you must make it impermissible for a good Christian to drink it. Clement was a smart cookie. Clement said, well, I can't declare something illegal unless I've tasted it. So bring me some coffee. So coffee was brought. He liked it so much, it is said, that he turned their request on its head. He says, the devil's drink is so delicious, we should cheat the devil, and we shall baptize coffee. Colonization. the growth of coffee, Pope Clement allowed for all that to happen because he baptized it. Clement knew that coffee was one of the first major global trading global trading commodities. Soon sugar would come, and salt was coming, and spices were coming, and soon petroleum would be found. Part of the global economic system develops around coffee. In 1683, the city of Vienna is laid siege for the last time by the Ottoman army. The Janissaries, the Ottoman corps, they got all the time in the world. So what do they bring with them? Every battalion of the Ottoman army has its own Kavechi Basha. They bring the barista with them. He carries all the stuff, and on the battlefield, soldiers are off fighting. The coffee is being brewed. It is said in 1683, when the Polish army routs, in league with the Habsburgs, routs the Ottomans from the gates of Vienna, that there's bags and bags of coffee that are left over. And in maybe an apocryphal story, the double agent who engineered the coming of the Poles, a Ukrainian by the name of Franz Kolschitsky, goes to the Habsburg emperor and said, all I want is the coffee on the field of battle and a little place in the center of town. It is said that he establishes Blue Bottle Coffee Company, the first major cafe in Vienna, although there were some from before, and he becomes an incredibly rich and wealthy man. And finally, my friends, we come a little bit closer to home, to London. If Ethiopia is where coffee had its origin, if Yemen is where it found its soul, if in Istanbul, Constantinople, it became an art form, then indeed in London is where coffee becomes an all-consuming culture. By the height of coffee, there's a coffee house for every 140 people in the city of London. There is literally you had your own private cafe almost. And it's because of a man named Pasquale Rosé, a Greek man, who served a British trader in Ottoman Greece. And when that trader was coming back, Pasquale Rosé said, let us start a business, dear sir. He said, what business? He says, we have trade with the Ottomans already. We will bring the best of their beans to London and let me set up the shop. You need to do nothing, just invest in it. He said, it's a deal. In 1652 in St. Michael's Alley, you can see the location today. In the great city of London, in the heart of now billions of dollars of financial industry, in the shadow of Lloyd's of London, the great bank and insurance business, there's a little sign that says, here, Pasquale Rosé opened the first coffee house. And what did he do? He dressed like a Turk. The robes of the Ottomans, a big turban, and he would go through the streets and say, come, be served. Be served the beverage of the East, the virtuous beverage. Some of you read it this morning in your primary sources. Coffee he became rich, but the Turk's head became associated. Whenever you'd see a Turk's head drawn or engraved into wood, you knew that was where the coffee shop was. This is just literally, I will tell you because I've walked these streets myself, this is no more than 2 city blocks in the heart of London. Just a little slice for you. There was a coffee house called the Athenaeum for poetry. There was a coffee house for politics. There was a coffee house for science. There was a coffee house for news. Lloyd's of London was a coffee house and became a bank. The first newspaper started in coffee houses. People would walk into a coffee house. They were known as penny universities. Why? It only cost a penny. And you paid on your way out. You didn't pay on your way in. You sat down in a coffee shop. On your way out, the person at the door would say, give me your penny. Some coffee houses didn't even charge only a penny. They would say, you cannot enter the house until you present a new couplet of poetry. You can't enter the coffee house until you give us a piece of good news. You can't enter until you tell us what's down at the docks. So someone would come into the coffee shop and says, oh, I've heard that Claudia has just won the King's Lottery. Oh, we heard that 3 hours ago. Go away. Bring us back something. And then you can enter the coffee house. The coffee houses became the social libation. Habermas called them, in his more recent work, the great public squares, where people would meet. Penny universities, where the uneducated would become educated, where people would learn to read, where people would get news. This was the coffee. This was the coffee house of London. This is where it became a culture, a powerful social, political, and economic force, where deals were struck, where colonies were divided. It happened in these coffee houses. And yet, coffee brings us back beyond all of that. And we're just literally skimming over the surface of the story because the story is deep and fantastic and wonderful, and I could go on for hours, and you would throw coffee beans at me. But I do want to say this. I want to say that I think what allured me, and why I say London was the place where coffee found its greatest expression of culture, was because of the vitality of the coffee house. The place where you and I, it didn't matter race, religion, especially in the early days of the coffee house. Later on, coffee houses became more bifurcated, and the rise of tea and the rise of alcohol and the decline of the British Empire in particular in relation to coffee meant that coffee became less lucrative. And that's why in Europe you have a bigger coffee culture than you have in Britain, because in Britain tea became the culture. But in Europe, up until really the modern period, coffee is still very heavily traded. The British don't trade as much coffee. The Americans trade a lot of coffee, because coffee came to the United States when? With the founding of New Amsterdam. The very founding of this country, in that first century and a half, coffee's already here. It is said by the time the city of New York is incorporated and sold, the New Amsterdam is sold, and the city of New York is incorporated, that the taverns used to serve beer and coffee side by side. Coffee becomes an incredibly important libation. But for me, it's all about this. If there's something about the culture of the Middle East to which I feel great affinity, and the culture of the broader Muslim world and Muslim civilization I feel affinity, it's this picture. Palestine, Jerusalem at the turn of the century. Still the Kavechi Bashas brewing the coffee, roasting the beans, grinding them, and then presenting them to the old men, maybe coming out of the mosque, maybe enjoying an evening, but having the coffee together in a group. I love that because that was my first experience of coffee. It was sitting with my parents. It was having free conversation. It was being out of the house. It was the smells, the liveliness. There's something beautiful and powerful about that, seductive about that. And this is a picture today of my friend, Mukhtar al-Khanshali, a great coffee entrepreneur, and this brings us back to the Yemen. Over the years, Yemeni coffee was in strong decline. A lot of it because of mass production, a lot of it because of the growth of drugs like qat, a lot of it because large, particularly Saudi, operations were buying coffee at the lowest price. Over the last 5 years, Mukhtar, a Yemeni American who grew up in the worst neighborhoods in Brooklyn and Oakland, has gone back to his home country, the Yemen, and has become a coffee entrepreneur. I'm happy to say that from less than $1 a pound for the last 3 years running, the coffee now produced by these farmers, and I'll tell you a really sad but beautiful story to finish. These coffee farmers now make anywhere from $5 to $6 a pound. The coffee for the last 3 years has been the highest rated coffee by the Specialty Coffee Association of America, ranking in the 90 mark, 96, 97, 98, isn't it? Percentile of coffees that are grown. And at Blue Bottle Coffee Company in Brooklyn, 1 cup of these beans sells for $16. $16 for a cup of coffee. I know, it's shocking. I have paid that much, however, because I'm crazy. And it's delicious. This is such a cool picture, and Mukhtar is going to be visiting us, by the way, next term. So I hope we'll get the word out to you that he's going to be here. These farmers have never tasted their own coffee. 100% of the stock is sold to foreigners. They work their coffee their whole lives. Instead, they chew qat, they chew the slight narcotic, which also grows in their farms. This is a picture of the first time their coffee has been brewed with a measure of excellence. They've tasted it. And Mukhtar told me the story. He said literally they were crying. They were saying that our grandmothers produced this, our grandfathers produced this, and we really have never understood what a beautiful thing we had with us. Again, the power of coffee to bring people together, to make it the common man's gold, to make it a feeling of luxury and nobility. And of course, they say that coffee is they say it's an excuse. You know, the glee that comes from coffee isn't really from the coffee itself, it's from the good company. You don't need to add sugar to your coffee. The company should be enough. And so I hope in this very quick, but a little bit long, journey to the history of coffee. You've been inspired, and I hope something of it will stay with you. And I know the students have some awesome questions, so I just want to take a few of them because I want to honor their amazing work that they did over the course. So thank you very much, first of all. And we are gonna, and I'm gonna start over here. Sarah, is that okay? Okay, right over here. Let's go with you first, man.
You ready?
Lucas, right? Lucas? Yeah.
So I'm Lucas, and how did India affect coffee with its ancient culture? I asked this because we were looking at a painting, and you saw how the Arabians and the Muslim influence had on coffee, and just seeing how ancient India is with its culture and how large its population is. What did India do to coffee?
It's such a good question, man, and I wish I knew more. I know that coffee is brewed in a particular way in India, particularly in Tamil Nadu in the south, and coffee is much more popular than tea in parts of South India. What is interesting, though, is two things I can comment on. One is that the coffee house culture became very much part of the social movement culture in India. So a lot of unions and a lot of social movements would open coffee houses as almost clubhouses for their members. And that really started happening during the British period. So really during the early 1900s, late 1800s, you saw that. So there must have been a coffee culture already. My friends who are from Karnataka, I have some friends from the Malabar coast, from Kerala, when I've asked them about coffee, they say that coffee was very much part of their lives growing up, not only in the cafes where they would serve it with a lot of sugar, but also it was brewed at home a lot more. And I think that's maybe part of the Indian culture, is that there's this sense of the home and the hearth where it's brewed. But thank you for that question, because you raised it earlier, and it's got me thinking now. And of course, I was speaking to my friend who's of Armenian background. He was telling me a beautiful story about the way they brew the coffee in Armenia with the sand and that slow, beautiful brew that brings out the flavor. The thing is that coffee and culture they mesh into each other, Each culture takes on the beverage and makes it its own in a certain way, which I think is really beautiful. Awesome question, man.
Wonderful. All right.
Let's go for it.
Thank you. So I know that every single cash crop or a majorly produced crop that like indigo or coffee has always had a very violent and sad history. And seeing all these trade routes made around them in our textbooks and stuff, I've never myself, I personally have never seen a coffee trade route in our textbooks. So why aren't we taught about the significance?
My question exactly. I kind of feel like it's a good question. It's really missing. I'm going to give an answer. Some people might not like it, but I'm going to give it. Coffee is deeply associated with Muslim civilization and Arab civilization in particular. And I think our history books are terribly Eurocentric. And I think if you're going to trace the history of coffee back, you have to go deep into the relationship between Europe and this thing that we call Muslim culture and civilization, the Arabic-speaking world, and beyond. And that is a relationship, unfortunately, that is not covered well in our textbooks. I honestly believe that. And I'm sometimes shocked, even with Starbucks, when they used to give out this leaflet about the history of coffee, it would all be about Kaldi, the goat herder from Ethiopia, whose goats ate the coffee bean and started jumping up and down. And that's how coffee was discovered. I'm like, dude, how do we get from the goat herder to global trade? I mean, there's a whole story there. So I think a lot of it, and I think you're good to ask the question, because I think those are the kinds of historiographic questions that we need to ask about what we're learning. So I sincerely appreciate that. We're going to go to this group here on that side, and then we'll come back. Go ahead.
Just 1 second. We need to get you on the mic so everybody can hear you.
Was coffee used for or anything except was coffee used for like medicines or anything?
Yeah, so there's an interesting sort of medical. So we know that, for example, coffee was identified as early as 1100, 1000 to 1100, by some of the Arab practitioners of medicine, and in their books they talked about this plant, which they gave various names to. And they said it would give sprightliness and energy to those who were down or depressed, or those who had lack of energy in their body. So this idea that they didn't call it caffeine, but that it was seen for its medicinal value very, very early. Nowadays, of course, we accept the medicinal value of coffee, but also there's all debates around whether caffeine is good for you or not. But nowadays, we often talk about caffeine as being an essential ingredient in painkillers because it helps the body absorb much quickly. So there's something about caffeine that is it's alive and it's potent. I am definitely of the caffeine is awesome camp, and I believe that the tea lobby is paying researchers to give us alternative advice, but that's fake news. So I will fight the case of Coffee's Corner till the end.
Self included.
Go ahead.
So in Japan, those people drink a lot of tea,
yeah.
and they live longer than us that you're drinking coffee all the time. So is there like?
Can
a
it be
reason
only
why?
tea though? Can it be only tea? I'll tell you something interesting about Japan, and I'm glad you raised Japan because I think one of the things we think about is that, well, you know, tea is from China, Japan, Korea. There's a tea culture, and of course there is. In recent times, the Japanese have bemoaned the loss of their tea culture. After the Second World War, coffee became the most popular beverage because of the presence of Americans and American GIs. So a lot of old tea houses became coffee houses. Today, Japan is considered amongst the finest brewers of coffee in the world. They've turned coffee into an art form. When I went to Tokyo, I literally spent my days there going coffee shop to coffee. That's all I did. And I saw the entire city. It was beautiful. But I'd go to places where, honestly, the baristas would have you know, braces on their arms. And I was like, dude, what happened? Did you fall? He goes, no. I start pulling shots from 6 in the morning, and I only give them to customers at 11. I'm like, 5 hours of pulling shots? They're intense. It's a craft for them. And so I think you find that in the East, coffee has become a real art form. About longevity, I would argue that they live longer for other reasons. I'm sticking to it. Go ahead. We'll take 2 or 3 more student questions. Your group over there. Yes, go for it, please.
Oh, Mia, here we go.
I didn't think you were looking at me. But anyways, this is towards you. Like, what is one thing that you find so satisfying about coffee? And what about it makes your day just beautiful? Because I've noticed that you just love it so much.
You know, I say there's 2 things. One is that, you know, when that morning cup, I brew it myself, and I have that first taste, it's just, there's so many flavors. There's fruit and berries, and there's all kinds of things that begin to happen. But there's something in my body that immediately when I have it, I go, oh. And I allow the flavor to overwhelm me. And I think that's because my wife and I kind of joked that there was one day that we actually had a God shot, this beautiful shot of espresso, and it was in London. It was one of our favorite cafes, which was run by actually a Greek couple who were young and who were from Athens and lived in Athens in Australia, actually. And they lived in London, and their coffee was called The Taste of Bitter Love. I love that name, Taste of Bitter Love. So my wife and I, before we had our son, used to go there every Sunday. I remember we were sitting outside on a Sunday, autumn day. We already had 1 cup of coffee with them, and the barista came over and he says, guys, I've just made something for you. It's a new bean I've got in. I don't know how it's going to be, but I think you'll really like it. He gave it to us. And at that point, my wife was not an espresso drinker at all. She was a brewed coffee drinker. And that took a while as well because she never grew up with coffee or tea. Strange, but she is from Bangladesh, so I don't know how that works into it. Both of us had the coffee, and I remember we were silent because it was this amazing flavor. It was like it rolled over my tongue, and it never achieved bitterness. It was like an intense sweetness that took over my mouth. And we both looked at each other and we're like, what just happened? It was like we were transported. And I think that's the thing about flavor. I mean, flavor is so powerful. You know, I think about my grandfather who was paralyzed for most of the second half of his life, and he lived in the southern Punjab. But there were days that I know that a certain food would be cooked, right? And he would smell it, and he'd just smile, and all this memory would flow back into him. And he would say, oh, your grandmother used to make this, or I remember my mother making this. I mean, smells have history to them, don't they? They remind us. One of the pieces of poetry that 2 of you read was the poem by the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish, who in 1983 wrote about the coffee that his mother brewed. You can't not read that and not weep at the end because he's remembering his mom and he's remembering the love, and it's not coffee anymore, it's the house and the home and memory. And in fact, in India, to your question, there's the coffee houses of old India from the colonial period are nowadays called palaces of memory, because there are all these places where a lot of history is preserved on the walls. And so it's quite magical. So I would say that those are the kind of magical things for me that have. We'll take one more question.
I think we
know
have the
time is
question
going.
right
You've all been terribly
One of our
patient.
team leaders.
So, do you believe that coffee was the first quarter between social and economical boundaries?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue, and I think based on the evidence, coffee really is the sort of beverage or food which broke that boundary between public and private, that created in cultures where there wasn't a tradition of restaurants or cafes, this space, and out of that, everything else grows. If you can imagine how disruptive it is to break out of the nexus of the mosque, the markaz, the madrasa, the religious institution, the economic institution, and the knowledge institution, and to have space out of that for discourse. Discourse is happening, of course, but it's happening in your home, right? There's a custom of the diwan. The houses in the East are designed for it. There's a room that is for the guest. Everyone comes in, you talk, you discourse, you concur, you share. But now to take that outside of the house, and for that to be, and also with trade comes cultures coming together. Cultures come together. The cultures of Europe mix in with the cultures of the Muslim world and vice versa. They influence each other. They have an effect on each other. When the Moroccan ambassador in 1604 arrives in Elizabethan London and he's walking around with his fine robes, people are looking at him and say, where did he come from? The next year, Othello is published. You know, and the coffee houses are growing because it's an Arab drink. There's all these interesting connections. And I think that's, in a way, we're living in a world, I feel often, that we're living in a world where those social interactions, those fuzzy edges, we're not paying enough attention to them. You know, I think we live in a time of silos. And I think coffee, with every sip, helps us free that. And remember, when you have that Tanzanian coffee and Ethiopian coffee, think about the farmer. Think about the women and men who pick that coffee. It's hard work. You gotta pick it. You gotta dry it. You gotta hull it. You gotta make it good. And try as much as you can to buy from places that do direct trade, at the minimum fair trade, but direct trade so that we know the stories. Part of what I love about coffee, there's a story in every cup. I know that when I'm drinking someone's sweat and their blood and their tears and their family. It's all gone into that cup. And that's like with anything, all the things that we eat and produce, someone had to produce them. Someone struggled for it. Someone's maybe in poverty because of it. So it's part of this awareness that I think each and every one of us personally can develop around the foods that we eat and around the things that we imbibe. Thank you so much for being so patient. Your questions were awesome. I hope we can gather them because I'd love to have a copy of them, which would be awesome. Sarah, it's all yours.
Of course.